Welcome back to our program. My next guest is an award-winning author who's written a number of books on various topics in our history, the latest of which is entitled Unbound, Mao's Great March Across China, which has just hit the shelves. He's also been traveling around the country speaking about it, was in the area. He was at the New York Public Library in Chinatown yesterday and was also traveling around Connecticut and Fairfield, up the shoreline in Madison, New Canaan. Here he is, Dean King. Dean, thanks for being on with us.
Bobby, great to be here. Thanks.
This, if nothing else, is a difficult to swallow subject matter. It's certainly, I suppose an encouraging, but yet not necessarily a bright spot in the history of the world. Tell me a little bit about how you were drawn to this.
Well, I mean, the Long March is a fascinating period of modern Chinese history, really a benchmark moment, and particularly for the 30 women who were with Mao's army of 86,000 men. The Long March is best known for the fact of power on it in the Chinese Communist Party, but the little-known fact is that there are these 30 amazing women that were along with the army. 86,000 men set out. They went 4,000 miles on foot in 1 year, and about 10,000 of the men made it, but all 30 of the women did. And it would propel them on to major leadership roles in China. It was just a game-changing moment for women in China, for women's liberation.
Would that have been an unusual occurrence to have that many women serving in an army?
Well, traditionally there weren't women in the armies in China. I mean, there are some famous Chinese women, warriors in ancient China, but really they had some special skills. They were good organizers. They were very good at recruiting soldiers, at going in and finding provisions out in the countryside, and also at putting on living theater. They would set up stages, and that's how they would present news and the red message to the peasants and to their own army was through, they were mostly illiterate, so the theater was how they did it.
Well, that's interesting. I didn't know that at all. So to some facet, that was, I guess, a version of USO, if you will. Yeah,
in a way. Everybody always asks me, were they comfort women? No, they weren't. These were very highly skilled women who had leadership roles and went on. 2 of them were elected to the Central Committee later. One became one of the 8 elders of China, which is the group that is consulted on major national issues, and they went on to be leaders in the industry and the arts, and also in campaigning for women's rights and children's rights.
What do we know about Mao? Tell me a little bit about the context of which this occurs. Is this a surprise for somebody that maybe hadn't read about this facet of his career to think that there would be this amazing group of women amongst the men in his ranks?
Well, this took place in 1934, and the Red Army was very progressive in terms of including women and freeing women from, traditionally they had suffered domestic servitude in China, particularly either the peasants out in the countryside. So this allowed them to leave the house and to have more of a public life. It really was, before things went awry, they were doing some good things, and particularly for the women who had, been basically enslaved to the household for 2,000 years in China.
Why traditionally do we think of China as being a little behind the curve of other developed nations when it comes to human rights, women's suffrage?
Well, I mean, the traditional symbol of women in China is bound feet. Where they actually had their feet crushed and their toes turned back to their heels so that they could fit in 3-inch slippers. And really, you don't really need to say more than that, but that kept them in the household. And it was just a strange custom that developed there. So they were behind the curve a little bit there. But with what the Communist Party did in the modern century, in the last century, really brought them up to speed in many ways.
I asked that question because it seems as though it might be, this particular instance, an anomaly in the history of the country.
Yeah.
Again, we have this perception of China, and then you look back at this extraordinary occurrence so many years ago, and you would not have suspected that women would have been part of a march by a military leader.
Right. That women traditionally had not been part of the military, but the communists quickly realized that they needed women, that they needed the women in the villages to support them, to encourage the men to enlist, and so they quickly liberalized things for women, including they banning the binding of feet, getting rid of arranged marriages. Young girls were often sold as tongyang shi, child slaves. that would child brides that would go and have to be servants in their master's household. So there really were some very backward customs that the Communist Party changed, both for their own benefit and for the benefit of women.
What was the perception of the world of the march? And perhaps they were unaware of these 30 women that the book, the journey of the women that the book details. But what was, for example, the reaction of Roosevelt when we know that Mao is making this 4,000-mile trek?
Well, the really fascinating thing to me is that this story has longest and best been told by Americans. It was Edgar Snow who went in 1936, right after the Long March, interviewed Mao and some of the other leaders and wrote Red Star Over China, which became the classic. Nobody really knew what was going on when they did the Long March. If you look through the New York Times coverage or the London Times coverage, it was just scanty reports, and really took Edgar Snow to go in and write this book for everybody to find out. And then later, Harrison Salisbury, a New York Times reporter in the mid-1980s, wrote a complete account of the Long March. But so really, it's been little known, and it's not until really in the past decade where we're really getting accurate information about what went on, all the details. Two British guys went and walked the entire trek in 2002, and one of them led me last July through the snowy mountains, through the hardest and most deadliest part of the Long March.
Now, we should mention that you yourself not only submerge into the details of history, but you also have gone out, and I guess we could call you an adventurer to a degree.
Well, I like to do that with my sort of history that takes you onto the trail. With Skeletons on the Sahara, I did that. I went to Africa and went out on the trail and retraced their route, and I went to China twice and interviewed the last surviving woman long marcher in 2006. She was 93, and she died last year. I think I was probably the last person to interview her. And then, I went out on the trail in July and did a story for Outside Magazine, which ran last month. And, I really like to take the reader onto the trail.
Now, did you know that you were going to be writing this book? Is that the purpose of the journey, or is this a situation where this came to you as a part of your trek, and you said, I need to look more into this and then compile a novel about this?
Well, no, I went and did the trek just to, as part of the research. I tried to go, I was going to go in 2008, but where I was going was where the Great Sichuan earthquake was. So I really went right to the epicenter of that. It was late in my research, but I had an assignment from outside and really wanted to do it to get that kind of flavor for the book.
Well, it's a really interesting read. I'm just beginning to thumb through myself here. If you have a fascination with world history, Asian history, it's certainly a must-read. It's called Mao's Great March Across China, Unbound. About 30 amazing women who history has certainly forgotten. A great pleasure to get to speak to you a little bit. Dean King, I thank you for your time.
Thanks, Robbie.
And is that it? Is that the big show? Thank you to all my guests, Dean King, Tony Little, Sister Hazel, and the cast of Shakespeare in the Sound, especially Jesse Perez. Thanks also to Mike Bellamy, producer Nikki, our fabulous variety show band. Thank you for being along with us. We'll be back for more conversation and performance next weekend, same time, same frequency. Till then, take care.